globalization. We have invite Mr. We have invite Peter Murphy from Workis, Cody Urban from No to APEC Coalition, any Listery from the International Migrant Alliance, and Sarojini Rengam, Vice Chairperson of ILPS. We also would like to acknowledge the efforts of organizers of the webinar, namely Asia Pacific Research Network, International League of People Struggle, Asia Pacific, International Migrant Alliance, International People Front, International Indigenous Movement for Self-Determination and Liberation, that is IPMSDL, People Over Profit, and No to APEC Coalition. So now let us invite our main speaker for today. We have with us Peter Murphy, who represents the Philippines Australia Union League.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, Peter, we can hear you.
Okay. Thank you. And thank you everybody for taking part in this Zoom forum. I can say the work-ins part of my intro is Workers' International Struggle Initiative, which is part of ILPS. So the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation process was developed relatively early in the neoliberal transformation of capitalism, coming at the same time as the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the negotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and the transformation of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, called GATT, into the World Trade Organization. APEC played a crucial role in pushing the Marrakesh Agreement over the line to enable the WTO agreements to be finalized in 1995, and these had a huge impact on workers and farmers in developing countries in the subsequent years. When the WTO process became deadlocked after the Battle of Seattle in 1999, APEC continued to play a role of cheerleading for further trade and investment liberalization through the subsequent avalanche of bilateral and regional free trade agreements. So some details on APEC. It's a regional forum involving 21 economies in inverted commas, not nations, in the Asia Pacific region. They are the US, Canada, Mexico, Peru, Chile, that's on the American side, and then Brunei, Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam in Southeast Asia, and then Russia, China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Australia, New Zealand, and Papua New Guinea. So it includes 7 of the 10 ASEAN nations. The APEC economies are home to more than 2.9 billion people and make up, my computer's playing up a little bit. And make up over 60% of the global GDP. So it's a significant part of the human community and the global economy. But as you'll see as we go along, it's not meant to be tight and imposing on its member states. So the idea of APEC was first publicly broached by former Australian Prime Minister Bob Hawke during a speech in South Korea in January 1989. 10 months later, 12 Asia-Pacific economies met in Canberra, Australia, to establish APEC. So those 12 founding members were Australia, Brunei Darussalam, Canada, Indonesia, Japan, Korea, Malaysia, New Zealand, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and of course the USA. Just get my next page down. Between 1989 and 1992, APEC met as an informal senior officials and maybe trade ministers dialogue. In 1993, the US President Bill Clinton established the practice of an annual APEC economic leaders meeting. It's shortened now APEC leaders meeting to provide greater strategic vision and direction for cooperation in the region. So this was really when it stepped up. APEC was formed to encourage trade and investment liberalisation and facilitation at the border, across the border, and behind the border. It was aimed to reduce costs of cross-border trade to assist businesses. It was to encourage economic and technical cooperation, encourage exchanges of best practice information on trade and investment, simplified regulatory and administrative processes, and improved institutional capacity to implement and take advantage of the benefits of trade and investment reform. That's how they put it. So that's the official language of APEC. This is classic neoliberal agenda based on the philosophical position that only contracts between independent operators can establish true value. And so market forces must be enabled to facilitate this, and government intervention must be minimized. So that's the key idea. And you can see that APEC was all about reducing the costs of business across borders, at the border, and behind the border. So that really means domestic, liberalization and deregulation. APEC decisions are reached by consensus, however, and commitments are made on a voluntary basis. So unlike other regional trade arrangements and unlike the WTO, APEC does not make legally binding decisions or agreements. Government leaders come to APEC as leaders of economies, as I said before, not as elected leaders of governments. This is just a fantasy, really, but this formula is used to enable the participation of Hong Kong and Taiwan separately from China itself. This whole approach means that political accountability is effectively
Peter, please unmute yourself. Hello. Hello, Peter.
APEC voluntary commitments. There are no formal channels for engagement with civil. Yes? Somebody is muting me. Somebody is muting me.
Okay, all right.
Okay, can you hear me now, Renuka?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
thanks. How much did I just talk without sounding? Oh God.
Yeah.
Where should I commence? Oh dear.
Hello, Peter. Just proceed.
Okay. It keeps on muting me, I think. Oh, okay. I'll proceed. Okay, so there's this fiction that these are economies and not governments that evades most political accountability for whatever is said in APEC. And this comes to the next point. In 1994, the APEC leaders met in Bogor in Indonesia, and they released the Bogor Declaration, which proclaimed the goals of free and open trade and investment in the Asia Pacific by 2010 for industrialized economies and 2020 for developing economies. So you can see how radical it was, just announced by these leaders at that meeting without any consultation with anybody in their own countries. So these two targets, 2010 and 2020, became the Bogor goals. This meant zero tariffs, zero restrictions on investments, was what they were aiming to do, whatever the social and environmental impacts. So while the Bogor Declaration did not prescribe the actions that APEC economies needed to take to achieve these goals, it provided a guide. These guidelines allow for APEC member economies to implement unilateral policies, as well as taking a negotiated bilateral, regional, or multilateral approach, provided they are at least WTO consistent. So in 1995, the next year, the leaders met in Osaka and they adopted an action agenda to try to put some more pressure behind those Bogor goals. So they defined 15 areas in which goals must be achieved. So every 2 years, APEC member economies were required to prepare an individual action plan, an IAP, in which progress, as well as planned future improvements in these 15 areas were to be reported. So these IAPs are one of the main sources for anyone to assess the so-called progress on the Bogor goals. The APEC Business Advisory Council, or ABAC, was also formed in 1995. And so each of the 21 member economies can appoint up to 3 business representatives to this ABAC. And the annual APEC Chief Executive Officers Summit also meets, and there are other regular events for ABAC which let them give inputs into the APEC leaders on key regional issues as they define them. So this is the process for direct corporate influence in APEC. And of course, there's no parallel worker, farmer, or civil society process. The 2018 assessment of the Bogor goals is the actual last one that got published. As you can remember, 2020 was the final year in which the maximum goal would be achieved. So 2020, the pandemic had started, and I think that disrupted if they even wanted to do one final report. So the 2018 one claims that the overall average tariffs had fallen, that unilateral and negotiated services liberalisation measures had been put in place in many sectors, that measures to attract foreign direct investment were being implemented, that the cost and the time taken to undertake trade had been reduced, that efforts towards improving the quality of regulations was happening, and the network of regional and bilateral free trade agreements had continued to expand. However, the assessment also shows unfinished business and a need for continued improvement in a number of areas. For instance, tariffs in agriculture were still seen to be higher than those in the non-agricultural products area. New emerging unilateral restrictions in services were appearing, for instance, on cross-border data flows in the digital economy. Trade complaints had increased in the recent years before 2018. That is, governments were pushing back against free trade. And there was an accumulation of specific trade concerns in areas such as the sanitary and phytosanitary measures, that is the actual quality of production processes, their toxicity or dangers. Within APEC member economies, the neoliberal policies designed to achieve the Bogor goals have fueled a race, have fueled a race to the bottom on workers' rights and environmental standards in export processing zones and industries where international investors are free from regulation on labour rights and the environment. The first major protests against the APEC goals, that is the Bogor goals, and the process itself took place in the Manila, Olongapo City APEC leaders meeting in November 1996. The protest was built on the opposition of workers, farmers, women, students, and Indigenous peoples to the free trade policies just then unfolding from the WTO. It was a powerful expression with a conference, a people's caravan, and a protest at the US Embassy. the Philippine government shut down the national capital region and blocked the major highway to Olongapo to contain the protest. Similar vigorous people's protests then followed at Vancouver in 1997, Kuala Lumpur in 1998, Auckland in 1999, Chile in 2004, Busan in South Korea in 2005, Sydney, Australia in 2007, Bali, Indonesia in 2013, and Manila again in 2015. As we know, of the Bogor goals were achieved in 20 protests, both at APEC events and also trade agreements, which were the effective measures to advance these free trade and investment goals. In particular, the sustained campaigns against the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP, really blunted the corporate offensive, though there has been no decisive defeat yet of the neoliberal agenda. The data published by APEC for 2010-2020 shows that both exports and imports rose slightly. Services imports and exports fell slightly as a share of global trade in services. And the proportion of duty-free tariff lines rose only slightly, and foreign direct investment inflows and outflows rose during that decade. So this last data set is mainly reflecting Chinese foreign direct investment, in fact. So the data,
Excuse
I
me,
think,
Peter.
shows a significant failure. Yeah.
Excuse, you have 2 minutes.
Oh, good. I'm nearly there, but 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay. This last data set is mainly reflecting Chinese foreign direct investment. That is direct investment into China. This data shows a significant failure of the neoliberals to achieve the prosperity promised by their policies. On the other hand, the data also shows a significant fall in labour force for both men and women from between 1990 and 2020. Social inequality in incomes, with Mexico and APEC members not much better. There's some data you can find on the APEC website. Workers, the deep experience of APEC policies has been massive contractualization, decreasing real wages, suppression of trade unions, and unregulated expansion of migrant labour. This decade began with the impact of the global financial crisis and the Great Recession, and ended with the global economic stagnation evident just prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. Economic conditions are, if anything, worse than at the time of the Bogor Declaration. Through the period from 2005, APEC leaders' meetings became the site for side events for the TPP and now for the IPEF negotiations. This demonstrates the enduring value of APEC as a neoliberal forum. However, as the euphoria following the collapse of the Soviet Union has faded, and the appreciation of China's role in propping up Western capitalism has also shifted to antagonism, neither China nor Russia are now fully engaged in APEC. As well, there are only a few slots left for bilateral and regional FTAs globally, most glaringly between USA and the European Union. Many nations now have WTO plus agreements with each other, also rendering the WTO itself less significant as a focus for neoliberal ambitions. I should try to wind up. Okay. I've got a fair bit of stuff I prepared about the latest IPEF Pillar 2 text, which has come out before it's been finalised, thankfully. I would just say about IPEF, it's strikingly like APEC in that it's voluntary, it's mostly aspirational, it uses may and shall, not will. So there's no binding agreements actually coming from IPEF so far. So yeah, then the legally binding FTAs and the WTO agreements, but they demonstrate the undiminished determination of global corporations and their governments to impose neoliberal policies on working people everywhere. Because the anti-China policy is clear in IPEF itself, the role of trade agreements in inter-imperialist rivalry is also much clearer now than in the 1990s and the 2000s. So thank you very much, Renuka, and I'm happy to be part of the discussion at the end of the presentations.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Peter. Yes. Thank you, Peter, for the clear insight on how the APEC and neoliberal globalization have destroyed and left the run the economies of the country from the global south. Yes, and now we have our second speaker, Cody. Cody is from the Global Secretariat of the Resist US-led war movement, a global network of anti-war and peace organization, united of US-led war around the world, and a member of the No to Epic coalition. So welcome, Cody, and floor is here. You have 12 minutes.
Thank you so much, Renuka. And thank you, Peter. I feel like Peter gave a very kind of perfect transition point into what I will speak about today, which is how is IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that Peter finished off by introducing, how is this the mechanism that the United States will try to use APEC and actually supplant other powers using APEC for their own means? So before I talk, I want to just share something in the Zoom chat for those of you on Zoom. If you're not familiar with what IPEF is, I put a link to a post from our No to APEC coalition that talks about what IPEF is. So you can check that out later. But first, just to introduce my organization. So the No to APEC Coalition is a coalition of many organizations, mostly based in the United States, but we're now gaining other members from around the world. And our point of unity is exactly what our name is, No to APEC. As the United States is hosting the APEC meetings this year, we are uniting and saying that it's our turn. It's our turn to take up the mantle of resisting this neoliberal free trade institution, just like it has done in every single country it has been at. So what I'll talk about and try to fit into 12 minutes is how the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF, is being used as a strategy for the US to maybe make it into a new kind of APEC in its own image, but ultimately how it'll most likely fail in this. So IPEF is a free trade framework trying to redefine how free trade agreements go by the US. And I'll talk a bit about why that is. But first, just to name the countries that are in IPEF, there are 14 countries, 12 of which are APEC members. So that's the United States, South Korea, Japan, Australia, Singapore, Malaysia, Philippines, Australia, Indonesia, Brunei, Vietnam, and Thailand. And then 2 additional countries that are not APEC members are India and Fiji. Now, where IPEF fits into this, we'll have to kind of go back a bit in time to where Peter started us off in 1989 when APEC was formed, right as the Cold War was ending, right as the United States saw itself as the one hegemonic superpower across the world, thinking it could do whatever it wants with no consequence, economically, diplomatically, militarily. To describe how APEC was formed, the objectives of APEC by the US, I also want to reference another very significant alliance that the US leads, which is NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the largest military alliance in the world today. When NATO was formed at the end of World War II, the United States said that its objective was, quote, to keep the US up, to keep Germany down, and to keep Russia out. That was a direct quote by the founding Secretary General of NATO. Similarly, when APEC was formed, I believe that the mentality the US had was keep the US up, keep Japan in the middle, and keep China down. That's because at this time, China was had already begun to abandon its longstanding socialist policies of keeping workers communes and worker-run collectives, working throughout the country, and was now beginning to establish its own version of neoliberal reforms. But it was very much reliant on selling its products as cheap manufacturers to the United States. And the United States used this, and many other countries started to use this as a way to keep their manufacturing costs down. And so that's why APEC was meant to keep China down economically, but still at a place where it could be used by other members of APEC as a form of cheap manufacturing. The US at this time was still at the top, and it was using that position in the mid-90s to push its own regime of neoliberal free trade agreements. The biggest one that most people know is NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement between the US, Mexico, and Canada, which it used the WTO as the mechanism to do that through. NAFTA kind of redefined how neoliberal free trade agreements in the post-Cold War era would be, that started to give complete control to corporations to do whatever they want and change laws to allow more foreign investment. Now, fast forward to pass through the 2010s, where you see China beginning to rise economically. That allows China to rise diplomatically, to start to roll back, be able to have enough manufacturing and economic power to start putting more controls on how its imports and exports go, and therefore more control over allowing foreign investment to come in and out. And this scares the US. If China has more control over its economy and is able to assert that, what happens if it decides it doesn't want to give its cheap manufacturing to the US or other countries? What if it decides it's going to raise prices and so on? And this fear really started to come to fruition just a few years ago when China passed its own free trade agreement after the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The United States pulled out of it when Trump came in. China passed its own version called the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And this excluded the United States, but it included most of the countries in Southeast Asia and Asia Pacific. So now China has its own free trade agreement that is setting the rules in the region in its own image. And the United States is terrified of this. How will the US stay on top within APEC? Because now that first goal, remember, keep the US up, keep Japan in the middle as the main US imperialist kind of running dog in the Asia Pacific region, to be that backdoor through which more capital investment in the US camp can spread around the region. But to keep China down, remember just how the goal of NATO was to keep Germany down, keep Germany as a junior partner, subordinate to the US in NATO. China was supposed to be a subordinate partner of the US in APEC. Now China and even Russia, after it's added, are starting to push their own agendas more in APEC. There's almost a multipolar system within APEC itself, because we're now in a system of multipolar superpowers rising up. The US's dominance in world geopolitics is being challenged, and we're seeing this in APEC. This is where IPEF comes in. So as Peter mentioned a bit, IPEF is a new kind of free trade framework. That's the F in IPEF. And again, if you follow the link I put in the Zoom chat, you can find a little IPEF 101 with a link to a webinar that the No to APEC Coalition put on not too long ago. But it is meant for the US to get back on top and to try to make the bargaining power of China and Russia in APEC irrelevant. IPEF is almost like being sold as a buffet table of free trade agreements, as I like to think of it, because while RCEP is like a traditional free trade agreement where you either take it or leave it, any country that signs on to it has to sign on to the entire framework of it. IPEF instead has 4 different pillars: trade, supply chains, clean economy, it calls sustainable energy, and then anti-corruption. Again, you can learn more about those if you follow the link I put here. But this is its way to try to encourage members, and I know I have 2 minutes left, trying to encourage members to sign on to some parts of it, but maybe not, by saying like, because if it presents a whole free trade agreement like RCEP, what are other countries who are signed on to RCEP are going to say? Why should we have that? We're already signed on to this free trade agreement with China. We're fine. So the US, in its desperation, tries to present different options. No, just sign on to some pillars, not others if you want. But of course, its hope is that countries will sign on to the whole thing so that its trade, supply chains, and everything will go in with the way that the US is trying to set up its economic sphere. And this has started to backfire. For example, India, who's not an APEC member, signed on to all of the pillars except for the trade pillar. And the US needs trade with India in order to, it's one of the most significant countries in the region economically and politically. And so the US is desperate now that India didn't sign on. This is why Prime Minister Modi was given the red carpet into the White House a few months ago, so the US could bedazzle the Indian government with all these bilateral free trade agreements on technology and weapons sales, because that was the way that the US was desperately trying to fix the situation where India was signed on to only part of IPEF. And so in short, IPEF is the sign of a US superpower in crisis. This is its desperate attempt to try to stay on top of the free trade situation. And the best way to see that desperation is to look at the countries that are in IPEF and look at free military agreements that the US has in the region. All the main US military agreements, the Quad between the US, India, Japan, and Australia, AUKUS between the US and Australia and Britain, but mostly with Australia, and then the new trilateral agreement between the US, South Korea, and Japan on military exercises. These are all the main power players that the US is trying to get in IPEF. And I will finish, because my time is up, by pointing out how the US, where APEC comes in, is the US is trying to use APEC opportunistically this year. Because the US is hosting APEC, it's able to have these IPEF negotiations on the side. We saw this happening in Detroit, and it's already set to happen again in San Francisco with the ministerial meetings and the upcoming heads of state summit. And its final IPEF negotiations that'll happen in San Francisco just before the heads of state summit is an opportunity for the US to show off IPEF at the end. We are not going to let them do that peacefully in the No to APEC coalition. We are going to protest every single aspect of this. We were protesting in Detroit. We protested the ministerial meetings in Seattle. We are gearing up to protest the heads of state summit in San Francisco with a counter summit and a series of mass mobilizations. So if you and your organization wants to join the No to APEC coalition and learn how you can take part in this, from afar or close within the United States, I will send some links in our chat, and hopefully we can talk about how to work together. So no to APEC, no to IPEF, people over profit.
Thank you, Cody. Yes, we need more unite amongst the workers people of the world against the IPAC and other free trade agreements promoting neoliberal globalization. And now let's hear from our reactors. And I would like to invite our first reactor to Sarojini Rengam. And it is time to us for hear from Sarojini and how oppressed the rural uh, people are from the yokes of the neoliberal globalization. Sarojini is the vice chairperson of ILPS Asia Pacific, as well as the executive director of Pesticide Action Network Asia Pacific. So, Saru, you have
Thank
10
you.
minutes.
Thank you, Renika. Thank you for this opportunity to share some thoughts and react and have this opportunity to hear from Peter and Cody. And I think you both have set up the background on how from APAC to IPEF, there's a whole history of, even before that, it was also the WTO and all the struggles, to prevent the kind of impacts that which we are still feeling. And I think one of the key elements, I think, are, as Cody was and also Peter was mentioning, that this new idea of IPEF, 6 to 7 years after United States pulled out of the TPPA, the Biden's administration now has been pushing IPEF. It's really to renew U.S. regional economic involvement and offers an American-led option to counter China's economic influence in this region. And I think it's really a competition, and they're pulling all out. They're going all out to move this IPEF, and it's really to create an alternative to China's economic influence. And so, and therefore, basically to push the corporations, the profits of corporations, and it's very clear that from WTO to APEC to TPP and now IPEF, it's the same old push in terms of neoliberalization policies, deregulation, privatization, and it's nothing different. You don't see different ideas coming out, and it's really a push to maximize profits of the corporations, U.S. corporations in particular, in this push for this kind of neoliberal policies. And of course, IPEF, there's a lot of push also because of security concerns. Because of China's assertiveness, and so IPEF is really seen as a way to. There's no real, the kind of what do you call that, benefits from developing countries they're not being felt. And so as Cody was saying, that IPEF operates under 4 pillars, and it's all led by US agencies, and they all countries can choose to join any number of these pillars, but must commit to all aspects within the chosen pillars. According to the US, all all countries involved will benefit from the economic cooperation. But in reality, it's designed to advance US corporate interests and is an avenue for multinational companies to make huge profits, expand their control in all sectors, and mold the workforce, possibly sidelining traditional jobs. If you see the advisors in the negotiations, they're mostly from industry. There's a lot of secrecy. I mean, even from, you see that in TPP A negotiations, now with IPEF, and even during the bilateral discussions and negotiations, it's not very transparent. And so the exclusion of peasants and farm workers, organizations, unions, and women's groups, and the lack of involvement of a people's movement in addressing substantial questions and issues and problems that they feel, on the ground is disregarded, and it further exacerbates these concerns of lack of transparency and lack of public participation. If you look at the agriculture sector in the neoliberal policies, IPEF, especially now with IPEF, there exerts immense pressure on the agricultural sector, and they're pushing an agriculture that is industrial food production model, and is heavily reliant on chemicals from powerful corporations, displacing indigenous peoples and farming and fishing communities from their land and resources. These policies also fuel food price speculation, exacerbating global food crisis, and also what you call and it's huge. I mean, it's really alarming what's happening in terms of the food crisis, especially during the lockdown and after the lockdown. These policies also give tremendous power to the US and their and developed countries, and it heightens the power and profits of the world's largest corporations and financial institutions. They dictate whether people in a country can prevent the destruction of their forests, or to determine if carcinogenic pesticides can be banned. So that's the kind of power that these neoliberal policies and IPEF has potentially, been pushing for this kind of control. When they put their hands on food and food production, which is, not only a sustenance, it is also a form of the very essence of our existence, our livelihood, our culture. And so it also has the fundamental contribution to the well-being of society as a whole. So as small-scale farmers, we vehemently oppose any trade negotiations and economic framework that erodes the rights of smallholder farmers, including our right to land and resources, and anything that undermines the basic right to food for all citizens. Another major area that we are seeing in IPEF is that they're always talking about science-based decision-making. And so they are, in fact, reducing the regulatory regimes that are, having a good, or well, not good, but at least trying to regulate GM seeds and GM food, and so with these policies, you're finding that basically it undermines the ability of countries to ban GM and products, any GM products, imports, or their agricultural production. And the other obligation is to enhance seed breeder rights, which basically challenges traditional farming practices, affecting farmers' freedom to exchange and produce seeds and encourage biopiracy. So you have this issues of patents and trademarks, and it's really strange because our farmers, our indigenous peoples, are the ones who have actually developed these seeds and knowledge, indigenous knowledge, in terms of animal resources, seeds, and even uh, uh, practices. And these are being stolen or being, there's piracy that's happening. And these trade agreements and policies actually encourage these, quite systematically. Then you have the push also in terms of climate change. They talk about climate smart, sustainable production practices, but it actually will lead to restrictions of developing countries to provide support for their farmers for essential resources like local seeds, organic fertilizers, irrigation, and training and credit. So there is that potential with IPEF, but it's basically continuing what has happened with the WTO and the other bilateral and regional agreements. Then finally, I just want to kind of add that one of the as usual, no, with this you have the big corporations and their interests comes first in all these trade agreements, neoliberal policies, and in IPEF as well. So trade doesn't treat everyone equally. So you have women farmers, agricultural workers, indigenous women, fisher folks in poorer countries who will not benefit from the IPEF, and corporations will grow bigger and bigger and just make more and more profits. And one of the really learnings from and we heard from Peter and we heard from Cody that when you draw drawing from the painful lessons of past trade policies, which are characterized by systematic deregulation, privatization, and liberalization, the resultant significant job losses and livelihoods, extensive precarious employment, informal sectors grown, and loss of land and resources of farmers and indigenous peoples, and human rights violations of farmers who assert their rights, of people who assert their rights, is ongoing, and we will see much more of the same impacts of IPEF and the same flawed approach. So we reaffirm the right for food, the right for food sovereignty and agroecology, and we want to support localized production to meet domestic needs. So it's really important that we reject IPEF, reject APAC, and all the neoliberal policies that makes our life more miserable, and it impacts on our rights for livelihood, for the right to development, and right to resources. Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you, Sarojini. Yes, indeed. The working people, the workers, and the rural people must come together to together and oppose the exploitation and plunder of our economies, our economics. And now we have the our second reactor, and we would like to hear from Annie. Annie is an Indonesian migrant domestic worker in Hong Kong for over 20 years and a migrant rights activist. And she is the current chairperson of the International Migrant Alliance and has spoken at UN General Assembly and received the several nominations and awards for her dedication and work. Annie, please go ahead. You have a 10 minutes.
Thank you, Renuka, and good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Warmest greeting of solidarity from the International Migrants Alliance. IMA is a global alliance of a grassroots migrants, immigrant, refugee, and displaced people that defend and promote the democratic rights and well-being of all migrant, immigrant, and refugee workers. IMA is about building an international people movement of migrants and refugees in solidarity with people movement in host countries, home countries, and around the world, as we believe that we are all victims of the current plunder and exploitation of global capitalism and its current scheme of neoliberal globalization. I want to discuss with you why we, the migrant and refugees in IMA, do not want the neoliberal globalization. The system today is run by capital and driven by profit. Those who own capital or capitalists do not participate in the production, but instead they purchase and use the labor, the power of the working class, and sell their product. When neoliberal globalization was introduced in 1980s as a new strategy to save monopoly capitalism from its own crisis, it prevented the growth and development in many countries, especially in Asia, Latin America, Africa, and the poorer parts of Europe. It intentionally stunts the growth of these countries through economic control and plunder of natural resources, through unfair trade agreements, corporate driven investment rule, and provision of loans that are oftentimes packaged as aid. It has been devastating the economy of low and middle income countries. It creates a condition where many countries become a bottomless well of an army of unemployed and underemployed people originating from displaced workers, farmer, indigenous communities, urban, and other poor elements in the society. People desperate to survive who are eventually forced to sell their labor in foreign countries. Furthermore, the ruling classes in these origin countries systematize the export of their labor to other countries in exchange of investment, remittances, and government earnings in order to keep their economies afloat. They capitalize on migration to prevent an explosion of public discontent over economic hardship and denial of social services. Today, more countries are dependent on the migrant remittances. It ranks as one of the top revenues and used to save this government, from bankruptcy. Sri Lanka is one of its undeniable examples. Furthermore, neoliberalism promotes war, whether direct or by proxy. Imperialists push the war agenda to profit from military deals, topple government that resists imperialist dictates, establish puppet fascist regime, and divide and further redivide sphere of influence. As we all know, wars and conflict drive millions to become refugees and asylum seekers with extreme vulnerabilities. In short, neoliberalism has intensified forced displacement and set the stage for forced migration of people within and across border. Over the decades, the number of migrant and refugees continue to increase. By 2022, there are over 270 million migrants and over 60 million refugees around the world. This number is even bigger than the Indonesian population as the fourth largest nation in the world. But the exploitation doesn't stop here. Even after we become migrant and refugee, neoliberalism uses the displaced people around the world as stock of cheap, disposable, and flexible labor for their development agenda. Neoliberalism creates and perpetuates cheap and docile labor of migrants and refugees. How do they do this? They impose through highly controlled and restricted mobility and denial of human rights of migrant and refugees. Migrant and refugee labor are mainly recruited to perform 3D jobs, dirty, difficult, and dangerous, in industrial, construction, agriculture, mining, and other service sectors. They are paid as low as one third of the wage of the local workers and excluded from the labor protection without working hours and food regulation. The control over migrants and refugees are systematized through the visa policy with very short visa, like or no right to be permanent resident and border control. At the same time, refugees are given very limited access to employment, health, and education. When refugees gain access to work, however, the type of employment that they can perform doesn't fit to their actual skills. Meanwhile, women migrants are designated in stereotyped jobs that are considered as low skilled with very low pay, long working hours, exploitative living and working conditions, and vulnerable to abuses. Every time the global capitalist system experiences crisis, it is the migrant and refugees who are among the first to be sacrificed through massive layoff and deportation, arrest and imprisonment, stigmatization and discrimination. Under very repressive migration regime and slogan of migration for development, the already undervalued migrant labor becomes cheaper, more docile, and disposable. Why is there a need for unity between host and migrant workers? If we have to reflect on the COVID-19 and post-pandemic, there is one common lesson for us to realize. Every time there is crisis, the capitalists blame and attack our right as workers and peoples, regardless of our countries, ethnics, and religions. They use public money to save themselves and create new profit. In 2016, the wealthiest 62 people on earth own as much wealth as the bottom half 3.5 billion, and the top 1% were wealthier than the remaining 99%. Yet, during the pandemic from 2020 to 2022 alone, the richest 1% had captured around half of the new wealth, or almost twice as much money as the bottom 99% of the world population. Despite the outcries and protests, the world leaders choose to deny the people concerns and demand. From G20 meeting in Bali to G7 meeting in Japan to the upcoming APEC meeting in San Francisco, we witness the monopolies' attempts to save, even multiply their profits, while our government choose to safeguard business interests over the livelihood and well-being of their own people. This is the reason why we lose hope in our government, and we have no choice but to take matters into our own hand. Yet the growing protests of oppressed people around the world are confronted with repression and militarization. History has told us that when workers are united and build power and act in genuine solidarity, we can win and create a better system for humanity. We have achieved many victories for workers and people's rights in the past and even up to now. We must build upon these victories to face the challenges of today's against the deepening exploitation of all workers, the forced migration of hundreds of millions, and oppression of people and nations struggling to determine their own future and build a better world. Our resistance is not only justified, but necessary now more than ever. Thank you.
Yes, host and migrant workers unite against neoliberal globalization. Thank you, Annie, for emphasizing that the host and migrant workers have a common enemy. So now it's time for our open forum. We have heard from our Cody, Annie, and Saro. And now it's time to hear from our participants. All those questions have been itching to ask can be discussed now in our open forum and question and answer part of the program. So before start the question and answer, I would like to share the question for our speakers. Those are mentioned in the chat box. And the first question is, what is the other non-epic member of APEC aside from India, and what is the significance of the specific non-APEC members being brought in through the APEC, IPEF? So, who is going first?
I could start. So just to answer the first part of the question easily, the other non-APEC member in IPEF after India is Fiji. The significance, I think, is that the Pacific Island nations, and there are so many Pacific Island nations that are geographically small and very low lining, and I will point out are some of the most at-risk countries when it comes to the climate crisis and rising sea levels. So this is Fiji, Solomon Islands, Samoa, Tahiti. There are so many. I'm sorry if I didn't name a country that you're from in the region, but there are just so many. And on the one hand, these countries, because they are so impacted by rising sea levels from the climate crisis, there is a lot of opportunities that the capitalist countries are seeing for foreign direct investment in the form of climate aid to try and, what they're saying is protect these countries from rising sea levels and increased typhoons. But in reality, it's just another spot for easy dividends on investments. You see most of these countries and the investment companies don't actually care about if these climate mitigation things that they will be investing in are going to work, only that they'll be profitable. And if they're not profitable and they don't work, there'll be an easy way out for them, leaving these countries to fend for themselves. And so you're seeing the Pacific Islands being a major rivalry ground between the different sides of the superpowers within APEC. And so the US, including Fiji in IPEF, is sort of that opening for the US-led trade framework into the region. And this is happening at around the same time that the US is trying to establish its first ever military agreement with the Pacific Islands Forum, which was a group of a lot of the Pacific Islands. So I would say that is one of the big significance. And I will also point out that China just recently signed a military agreement with the Solomon Islands. And so we're seeing not just the economic rivalry of APEC versus RCEP within, IPEF versus RCEP within APEC. We're seeing the military rivalry in this area through the US Indo-Pacific strategy. So that, I would say, is the significance of Fiji within IPEF.
Thank you, Cody. And second, here is also the second question. The participant said, thank you, Peter, Cody, and our reactors. Can we talk more about each of the 4 pillars of IPAC? Can you highlight what are the new threats to people and planet posed by each of these pillars? So, who can reply or who can answer of this question? Yes. Yes.
Cody,
Yeah.
do you want to have a go? Oh dear.
Yeah, I'll just
you can
share
start,
real quick.
Cody.
Okay, I'll just actually, before I hand it off to you, Peter, I will share in the Zoom chat the recording from our What is IPEF webinar with the No to APEC Coalition, where you can watch big description of all 4 pillars. But then I'll hand it over to you, Peter.
Okay. Okay, I think, I'm good. Okay, I think pillar one on trade is probably the one that's got the most threats in it. That's the one that India refused to join itself. But it's not clear what's happening in the negotiation on the trade pillar, except that the US seems to want to have binding commitments. So this would definitely be like other experiences we've had in RCEP and TPP and the WTO, that tariff barriers would be reduced. And you can see that they've got a focus. They talk about food sovereignty and all of this, but their answer to the threat to food sovereignty is to have free trade in food. So even more deregulation. And I would think that this is the sort of nastiest aspect that I've noted myself in the material coming forward from IPEF. It's a sort of double speak. What they're sort of saying is, oh, well, the way any particular country can assure itself of having adequate supplies of food is to enable imports of food from everywhere in the world, especially USA, of course, um, and therefore damage their own domestic productive activity in terms of food. I think the one that they have published on supply chains, it's so vague. I myself cannot see anything specific in it that we could say is definitely going to happen. But overall, what it's about is to say stop sourcing goods and services from China, start sourcing them from the USA or US allies. So again, I think we can't predict what a disruptive effect this could have on people in our region, because I'm from Australia, and I think every other country in Southeast Asian region, their main trading partner is China. So you just imagine what they're really trying to do there. And so I think that precarious employment, higher costs, and so on would be all areas of concern for all of us. And the last two, there's a lot of fine words about climate and consultation about women, disabled people, Indigenous people, workers, but there's absolutely no commitments in it. It's just aspirational language. So it's possible that on climate, we would get the standard corporate projects, which we have been criticizing for a long time, like Cody referred to, so-called climate adaptation investments or offset investments, which turn out to be displacing communities, having ecologically bad impacts on forests and river systems. So I think we should be very skeptical, but we don't really know. The last one on corruption, it seems to be an effort to get more corporations to pay more tax, but just judging by who's really got the influence here, I don't believe that'll come to anything except fine words. There is a global concern from governments about tax revenues, and OECD and others are talking about it. But as I said, I don't believe we're going to see anything definite there. And as for anti-corruption activities, I just think it's such a corrupt system. What are they talking about? You know, we're going to see some window dressing. That's it. Yeah, so I think there's probably more to it, but I think that's all I've got at the moment.
Thank you, Peter. There is another set of the question. The question is, how will these FTA be carried out by reach the ASEAN nations as a military political alliance, and how has this looked like historically for our workers and farmers? So, Annie, would you like to answer this question?
Yeah. Can you repeat again, Renuka, the question, if you don't mind?
Yeah. How will this FTA be carried out by ASEAN nations as military political alliance, and how has this look like historical for our workers and farmers?
Thank you. So, in fact, in the Asia Pacific, we know that we are not independent region or independent countries. We have long history of colonialization and neo-colonialization even after the World War II up to now. So practically, we are not free. We don't have our own freedom of deciding our own economic and political design. Now, within ASEAN, if recently the Indonesian government, for example, they are also hosting ASEAN meeting. And part of that, the funny thing about this meeting, it become ASEAN plus 10. So the 10 countries are including the US, the Russia, the China, or, all big player. And their main agenda remain the same from the G20 in Bali, like for example, last year or 2 years ago up to now. The agenda remain into energy. They talk about militarization, especially the South China Sea. They also talk about how to say peace. They talk about Burmese issues. I mean Myanmar. But the point is, we know in ASEAN and in Asia particularly, there is currently repression against the people, even among the civil society organization, even those who are very national mainstream NGOs. All the more the people organization are being controlled, being monitored, and even protests are not freely allowed, and many people are facing arrest and also imprisonment. And this is the kind of very contradictory to what the ASEAN or the APEC or even G20 or even other formation are talking about, which is freedom of expression, democracy, and peace. We do not witness peace after COVID-19. We do not have anymore same kind of freedom of expression as we used to have even before COVID-19. So I think this is what worrying us, that many of the countries in Asia or within ASEAN are now under the armpit of all these superpower. The fight between the US and China are very much felt within ASEAN. There is one country who is very pro China, another country is very pro US, and we are people on the ground who are actually continue to suffer from high inflation. In fact, the living cost is very expensive. People thought that Asia is cheap, but it's not. And this is the reason why a lot of people now, especially post COVID-19, they lost their income. The middle class are falling to the bottom, and the lowest class of our society are now the extreme poorest. And yet the government keep remaking the statistic by saying the number of the poor are this only this percentage and so on, but we know it's a big lie. In Indonesia, the poor is already reaching 100 million, and this is Oxfam research. And on the ground, we witness every single day people lost job, and everyone literally fall into informal sector. When I say informal sector, they are only selling food, they are only using their car to sell something. Those are or gig economy, many of them become Uber driver, and they don't have any legal protection. So now the type, and plus what is very worrying, that the monopolies are now projecting AI and technology to replace most of the workers. So we are not safe at all. The crisis is not getting better. So we are really calling our migrant and refugee friends, even people around the world, do not wish that we are going to go back to the world where we used to know before. We are not going back there. We are going to the what I call it roller coaster era, where you are going down but you never go up. So we have to be ready. Anything could happen. Militarization is very much felt within Asia. Protests again, even simple public speaking is not allowed. A lot of people are being criminalized now. You don't have to be the organized leftist. You can be just anyone speaking on the social media on something, then suddenly the next day you might have legal case against you. So this kind of reality really put people with no choice. So I think, again, as what we believe in IMA, the only thing that we can do is really strengthen our ranks. There is nothing, the hope is not out there. The hope is only within us and our unity. But then again, it will require a lot of education. People on the ground do not understand neoliberal globalization. They don't understand capitalism. So as an organizer, we have to really spend more time of grounding all those language concept and actual, how to say, giving a concrete example and context why this thing happened and what should we do together. Thank you.
Thank you, Ini. Uh, then we have another question. The question is why it is that India did not sign on to the trade pillar, and do they employ more protectionist policies? Who would like to go first? Maybe Cody.
Sure, I could give it a try. So the question are, is India applying protectionist policies? I think that it's trying to. India is a big example of a country that has been warred over by superpowers almost like for centuries, even. And so, and even just in the last few decades, the Indian governments have been, for example, militarily completely reliant on Russian weapons exports. And then also it is relied on China as a main trading partner. But also it has been partnered with the US on many, many different economic and military ventures as well. For example, India has a border dispute with China. And recently the US and India held joint military exercises on the disputed border and took pictures of the Indian and American flags right there on the disputed border as almost um, war provocation. And so I think that India has often tried to play both sides to see what it can get. And one of the ways it's done that is signing on to RCEP, but then signing on to parts of IPEF so that it could try to have more control over its trade. But what is this going to be beneficial to the people of India? Just like many of the countries within both APEC and IPEF, India has a completely fascist government that is relentlessly attacking its own people. In the media, it pretty much gives open rein for calling out and targeting political dissidents. And of course, the G20 meetings that happened just this year, hosted by India, one of the meetings took place in Indian occupied Kashmir, where the Indian government has been waging a settler colonial project against the people there. And there was recently a major lithium deposit found there. So just how it was mentioned, how you mentioned the green economy or clean economy pillar of IPEF, one of the major ways that sustainable and green energy is made is through lithium ion batteries. And so who's going to want their hands on all that lithium? I believe that India is seeing this as an opportunity to not sign on to the IPEF pillar. It is trying to be the one that gets the say over how it will trade in this new lithium deposit that it is oppressing the Kashmiri people in order to get, or any of the other minerals or technology that it's oppressing all people throughout its country, workers and farmers and such, in order to get its hands on. So just like around the world, any government that is pushing for its any capitalist government or government within the capitalist imperialist sphere that's trying to push its own its own way in the trading system is doing it on the backs of its own people, like any really so beautifully portrayed. And people are resisting just as they are being oppressed. So I think that's the lesson to take away from how IPEF is showing this new development within India.
Thank you, Cody. And now it's 10:20 Philippines. So that is our last question, and now we will stop our webinar here. But before close this webinar, Once again, the IPAC was established the many decades ago, yet the impact of free trade and neoliberal globalization promoted by free trade agreements like APEC and IPAC are still destroying lives of the working people. And this webinar is a part of series of the information session about APEC and neoliberal globalization. And we hope you can join us on the next webinar should scheduled for 14th October 2023. So thank you everyone, and thank you once again to our speaker, Peter, Cody, Amy, and Saru, and all our participants who are joining from the all over the globe. So this is me, Renuka, saying see you at the next webinar, and more power to the working people of the world and fight on. And yes, I request every participant, please turn on your cameras for our photo.